I've been trying to find a Chaos God to pledge myself to for some time now, and I know that already sounds suspect, but it's only going to get worse when I tell you which god we're trying out today. I've tried a few different flavors of Death Guard, and I've tried desperately to bring my Age of Sigmar Chaos scheme, which I absolutely love, into the 41st millennium, to whelming results. And after all this time, I've started to wonder if maybe I'm just trying a little bit too hard, coming up with a grand narrative and forcing color schemes on Space Marines that just maybe don't work with that type of armor. I've tried Nurgle, and that didn't really fit. Khorne's always been a little bit too one-note for me. My gaming group's already got a Tzeentch player, and I'm still trying to find an undivided scheme that works for me. So that leaves just one canon Chaos God. So welcome to Gone Hollow Minis. My name's Colt, and today we'll be familiarizing ourselves with the ins and outs of Emperor's Children. Phrasing's gonna be an issue in this one, isn't it? Okay, gags aside, I've actually been thinking about Emperor's Children for about a year now, before their models were even announced. And really the decision making here is just, I like purple. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And my second favorite color, a nice kind of dark turquoise teal color, contrasts really well with purples and burgundies, so the Slaanesh color scheme seems like an obvious choice. That said, I am also really enjoying the lore as I get more into it. In particular, I really like the kind of diluted righteousness that the Emperor's Children sometimes exhibit. They don't see themselves as debased, or even in opposition to the original tenets of the Imperium. I've always struggled to get behind the evil for the sake of evil tone that a lot of Chaos has, so seeing a faction that honestly believes themselves to be the liberators of an Imperium that solely exists to force its people to live in mind-numbing drudgery is kind of interesting. It's almost a flesh-eater courts type of delusion that I find really interesting. Fulgrim even still thinks of himself as the Imperium's rightful heir, and says as much in his new novel. It's honestly a kind of fascinating look in on how Chaos works. And then the models came out, and oh boy, the models. Look at these things. The finery, the filigree, the sweeping sabred power swords, and beaky helmets, yes! I've also never been the biggest fan of the massive growths and chaotic mutations that a lot of the Chaos Space Marine range has, so I've kinda shied away from their model range for quite some time. But these new Emperor's Children models are perfect. There's filigree all over the place, tons of beaky helmets, and they also did something really interesting with the proportions. I don't have any legionaries to compare, but just looking at Primaris loyalists, the Tormentors and Infractors are really tall. They're super tall and lanky, really reinforcing the lithe Slaaneshi vibe, like these guys approach warfare like a dance. It's subtle, but a really nice way to differentiate them from all the other power-armored armies. But okay, that's enough waffling for now. It's been quite some time since I did a straight-up paint tutorial, so why don't we get back into that and paint some purple? And in the spirit of Slaanesh, why don't we pull out some new toys and tools to do so? I've had an airbrush for some time now, but it's always kinda scared me. Understanding a brush is already deceptively complicated. Then you throw in an air compressor and all the mechanical bits and yeah, I totally get how it would be intimidating. But how can I expect myself to achieve the level of perfection that Slaanesh wants for me if I have a tool that I just never bother to learn how to use? No more, I say. So I'm going to be forcing myself to learn how to use the airbrush by painting this Lord Exultant. We're going to start out with a black prime. Nothing fancy here yet. But then we're going to do a quick Zenithal. Usually I do these with just a rattle can or a dry brush. Not entirely the same thing, but basically the same effect. With an airbrush though, it is so much easier. I'm using a white acrylic ink here. Inks are much more heavily pigmented, so we can get a really nice Zenithal with only 1 or 2 layers. I'm also not just focusing on the elevation of my light source while doing this. Light plays differently on different shapes, so I'm trying to recreate that. More circular highlights on the pauldrons, more linear reflections on the arms and legs, stuff like that. With our base and Zenithal applied, we can move on to the armor. This is a base coat of Army Painter Terrestrial Titan mixed with a little bit of Vallejo Magenta. This makes for a nice bright purple that I'm sure you could find bottled somewhere. These were just the paints that I had on hand. Once that's on, I'm going to set up my highlights. To do this, I'm just using a bit more white acrylic ink to apply a much more specific, much more controlled highlight. I'm using my previous Zenithal layer as a guide, placing this focused layer right in the middle of where that one was. Now I could have just been a little bit more careful with my base coating step, but I'm still learning the mechanics of the airbrush, so we'll worry about learning precision a little bit later. It's also worth noting that we don't have to do this white layer for all of our highlights. I just want this jump from purple to magenta to be pretty stark and dramatic. The next highlights that we apply are going to be done later with a brush anyway, so we can control brightness with our paint consistency. Once that's done, I'm jumping straight up into magenta. The airbrush and the previous white layer make it super easy to get nice smooth blends. This is also a nice thing about using a mixed tone for your base coats. You already have your highlight colors pretty much settled. One last step on the armor before we put the airbrush away. I'm going back in with just a little bit of Terrestrial Titan without any magenta added. This will be the shadow color, and I'm applying this to all the recesses and towards the bottom of all of my armor panels. Okay, I'm going to hit pause on the armor here for just a second. We still have one layer of highlights to do, but I want those to be really specific and really carefully applied, so we're going to be doing those with the brush later. There is still one detail that we haven't worked on yet though, and that's the cape. To be honest, it's kind of the part of the mini that sold me on the model as a whole. While we have seen Space Marines with capes before, they're usually ratty and weathered. This one is pristine and flows like silk, which is a really unique way to reinforce the Slaanesh vibe. But in order to protect all of that hard work I've put into the purple armor, we need to do some masking. To do that, I'm going to use the highly technical and very professional tool of silly putty. Like, just regular silly putty. What's nice about it is not only that it's cheap, I picked this up from the grocery store for like $5, it's nice because it sticks well enough to the miniature, but is gentle enough not to remove any of our previous layers as long as we give them time to dry. It also doesn't leave any slimy residue, which, while it would be fitting for a Slaanesh model, it doesn't really make for good painting. So I'm just covering as much of the purple armor as I need. I won't be able to get all of the fabric with this airbrush, but I can at least get most of it. Pretty much the same process here as with the armor, just working with different colors. The base is Scarab Green, then I work into Templegate Teal, and finally Talisman Teal. Then I go back into the shadows with Scarab Green, mixed with a tiny bit of Terrestrial Titan to darken it down a little and make the shadows in the recesses nice and rich. Now we can finally pull all of the silly putty off to see how our Lord Exultant is looking. And now we're on to hand painting. First thing is to touch up all the parts that I just couldn't reach with the airbrush. So the underside of the cape, the little loincloth thing, and the helmet plume. The recipe is all the same here, so I won't bother dragging you all through that process again. But a little bit ago, I did mention that we had one more highlight layer to do on the purple armor, and we'll get to that in just a second, but first a brief note on how purple works. As you're highlighting purple, you have a couple different options. You can either go brighter or lighter, if that makes sense. If you go brighter by mixing in magenta, like we've done, you end up pushing further into the pink spectrum. If you go lighter by using lighter purples, you can end up pushing into the lavender side of things. Either option definitely has uses. Like if I were doing a more gritty, realistic paint job, I might be more tempted by the lighter lavender approach. But for this Slaanesh worshipping excess lover, I want to make sure my colors stay bright. The problem is, if you remember, we've already jumped straight into magenta, so how do we push that brighter without losing saturation? If we just add white, we'll end up going into paler pinks, so we want to make sure we're keeping our warmth. So I'm going to use a skin tone instead of a white. I actually really like Army Painter Agate Skin for this. It's a pretty warm skin tone, and it really helps to add some more brightness to magenta and burgundy tones without desaturating things too much. So I'm going to do just that. Mix a bit of agate skin into my magenta, then thin it down to make sure my layers are nice and easy to blend, and apply this to all of my highest highlights. Remember, try to follow the shapes of each armor panel. The rounder the object, the rounder the highlight. I also edge highlight a few of the upwards edges, but I'm not going too overboard with this. Okay, one last thing to focus on here, and that's the trim. I know Chaos Space Marines are notorious for it, but we're in kind of a tricky spot. We already have a ton of really bright colors, so if we make our trim color a bright rich gold for instance, we risk making the entire thing just read as one too bright mass. And while I know excess is the point of Slaanesh, trust me, there is such a thing as too much. So instead of going for a rich bright yellow gold, I'll be going for a more brassy, warm, almost silvery tone. We can see here I originally tried to establish my shadows with Army Painter Rough Iron. Usually this isn't a bad call to do first, but we're working with such small areas on this trim that it was actually just easier to base coat first and then come back through for the shadows. Speaking of base coats, I'm starting with Scale 75 Moonstone Alchemy. This is an interesting metallic color, somewhere in the middle of gold, silver, and brass. But most importantly, it's not quite rich enough to blend into the other massive bright colors that we've already applied. And then I can go back in and apply my shadows. Finally, I'm mixing just a little bit of Leho Metal Color Silver into my Moonstone Alchemy for a highlight tone, hitting all of the edges and highlights. After that, it was just a matter of hitting all the random bits and details. Silver for the sword and whip, a nice turquoise for all the gems, and making sure I get into all the greebles that are scattered across this mini. Once that was done, I was left with something that looked a little bit like this. This was a really fun miniature to tackle. I don't get to do super bright colors all too often, so this was a nice change of pace. Who knows, maybe I'll pick up Emperor's Children as a bit of a palette cleanser army, in between all the super weathered minis I usually do. So let me know if you'd like to see more whips and chains on the channel, and I'll make sure to keep the Slaaneshiness coming. Gross. But if you enjoyed this tutorial, make sure to drop a like and leave a comment to let me know what you thought. Subscribe and turn notifications on so you don't miss the next upload, and until next time friends, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.